Hello folks, welcome to chapter 15, Unemployment.
Unemployment data is produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States Department of Labor. We are familiar with this department, right? Because we learned in chapter 11, the BLS also produced the CPI. So in chapter 11, we already learned this Bureau of Labor Statistics, and except the CPI, it also produced the unemployment data. So what they do, based on a monthly survey of 60,000 households, current population survey. So they usually publish the unemployment data rate monthly, according to 60,000 households. The survey just based on the adult population. Adult population in the United States means the people who are older than 16 years old. So in this part, in this slide, what we need to remember that when we talk about unemployment, we just talk about the adult population. It will not include the people who are under 16 years old. All right. How is employment measured? So usually, BLS divided the population into three groups. They are employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. What kind of population or labor force should count as employed? Usually, they are paid employees, self-employed, and unpaid workers in a family business. And these three definitions are really important. That's the key definition in this chapter. So you should understand what group of people should belong to which groups. And for employed, no matter that person or that group of people are part-time or have a part-time job or full-time job, that's still implied, right? So that's implied the definition. What kind of people belong to unemployed? It should be the people not working who have looked for a job during previous 4 weeks. This part usually we do not care about. What we really care about is this group of people really looking for the job. If they do not have a job right now, but they still looking for the job, so this one is important. Then this group of people would be the unemployed. And it also includes the people like they are waiting to be recalled to a job from which they had been laid off. So that kind of people also belong to the unemployed. The last category is the not in the labor force. So it's everyone else beside these two, employed and unemployed. So basically for these two groups, which means the people who really want to have a job during this period. So this is what we call the labor force. And the people not in the labor force means the people who really do not want to find a job recently or currently. So usually it includes the full-time students, the homemakers, and the retirees. Usually include these three parts. So again, these three definitions are important. What labor force includes? It equals to the employed plus unemployed. That's the labor force. So when we talk about labor force, it's the total number of workers. And again, that workers are the people who really want to have a job or is looking for a job or is working right now. They want to work. It's the labor force and not include the people who do not want to work or is not looking for a job. This definition is also important. The discouraged workers would like to work but have given up looking for jobs. Remember, your people giving up looking for jobs, that's not including in the labor force because they are not looking for a job. This is a group of people, the discouraged workers, belong to not in the labor force, rather than unemployed. For unemployed, this group of people have to look for the job. The next slide, again, is some calculations and which you are going to use a lot. That's two equations you need to remember for this chapter, and you are going to use to answer the questions in your assignment and in your test. The first important equation is the unemployment rate, or the U rate. It's the percentage of labor force that is unemployed. So U rate equals to 100. When we talk about the percentage, we usually times 100 times the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. Here, the denominator should be the labor force. It's not the adult population. Remember, the difference between the adult population and the labor force is the adult population is the total number of all adult people. But the labor force only includes the people who are working or who really want to work. That's the labor force. So for unemployment rate, the denominator should be the labor force. For the people who do not want to work recently, that should not include in the labor force or unemployment rate. So please remember this equation, that's very important. And the next equation is the labor force participation rate. It's the percentage of adult population that is in the labor force. Equals to 100 times the labor force divided by adult population. So in this one, the denominator is the total population, or total adult population, who are older than 16 years old. And the numerator is just the labor force. That's the equation for labor force participation rate. Labor force equals to employed plus unemployed. So please remember these three equations. Compute the labor force U rate or unemployment rate, adult population, and the labor force participation rate according to these three numbers. So first one is the labor force. Labor force equals to employed plus unemployed. So for the labor force, you should use this one, employed plus unemployed. Plus these two numbers, that's the labor force. If we have the labor force, that's the answer for the first one. How to calculate the unemployment rate? The numerator should be the unemployment here. That's the numerator. And divided by the labor force, what the number we calculated before, right? Or employed plus unemployed. That's the second result for the unemployment rate. The adult population. Adult population equals to the people in the labor force plus the people not in the labor force. So in the first part, we already have the number for the labor force, and plus this number here. The last one is the people who are not in the labor force of the population, not in the labor force. Together would be the adult population. The last one is the labor force participation. Again, the numerator should be the labor force, right? And that's the number we get at the beginning, and divided by the all adults population. And what we get here, the numerator and denominator. The result would be the labor force participation rate. So this is the result. Labor force, unemployment rate 3.7%, adult population 259.4 million. Labor force participation rate use the result of the first one, that's the labor force, divided by the all adult populations. This is the third result. So the final number would be 63.2%. According to this table, that's the various demographic groups, and the data is August 2019. So what we can get from this table? Well, first of all, the first row is the white, right? Men, women, and labor force participation rate. We can see that for white men in the United States, the labor force participation rate for men is higher than the women, which means white men has more eager to looking for the job. The more of them want to have a job outside, out of their own home. But some women, maybe one third of women prefer just to stay at home and do not want to work at all. Remember, for the labor force, it's the people who want to work or is already working. But another 42% of women, they do not want to work at all. And, but for the unemployment rate for both men and the women, they are almost the same for white people. So which means for the people who are looking for the job, most of them are going to have a job. They will be employed. Only a small percent, only around 3% of them cannot find a job currently, and they still looking for a job. And that's for the white. How about for black? For the labor force participation rate, you can see the difference between men and women, and not too much difference. Just 2/4 of them are looking for the job or want to work. And the percentage for black men is smaller than the white man, which means white men want to work more than the black men. For black women, they want to work more than the white women. But the unemployment rate, although the labor force participation rate are almost the same for black men and the women, but we can see that unemployment rate for black men are higher than the black women, which means just in black people, black women are easier to find a job than black men. So that's what we can get here. How about the teenagers? Well, first of all, we can see that for labor force participation rate, only one third of them, no matter for white or black, for teenagers, the year old is between 16 years old and 19 years old. Only a third of them want to find a job, which means most teenagers do not want to work at all. So only smaller, one third amount of them is looking for the job or already in the job market. And for the unemployment rate for teenagers, the number is higher than the white men, women, or black men and women, which means maybe that's another reason like why only smaller amount of teenagers want to work or want to find a job, because the unemployment rate for them are kind of higher. It's kind of harder for teenagers to find a job. That's we can get from this part. The all ages and the other races for Asian people and the Hispanic people. For labor force participation rate, we can see that not too much difference. Usually just the three-thirds population, no matter white, black, Asian, or Hispanics. Usually just 2/3 of them want to work or is looking for the job or already in the job market. But when we compare the unemployment rate between the Hispanic, Asian, and others, we can see that usually for Asian people, the unemployment rate is smaller than the other races. For Hispanics, the unemployment rate is higher than the white people, but it's kind of smaller than the black people. And according to this table, we can kind of get the conclusion that the Asian people are easier to find a job than the white people, and then the Hispanic people, and the last one, or the people who are hardest to find a job, are usually the black people. So that's what we can get from this table. This table is easier to understand. Just according to the different education level, we can see that from the lower to the higher, the labor force participation rate is higher for the higher education level, which means the people who learn more, who have a higher school years, and this group of people are going to find a job or want to find a job, like more than two-thirds, right? Because the average is just like 2/3 here. But for the people with bachelor degrees or higher, more of them are going to look for the job or count as the labor force. And the unemployment rate is the opposite. For the low-level education people, the unemployment rate is higher and is getting decreased. For the people who have a bachelor degree or more, usually the unemployment rate is smaller than 2%, the unemployment rate. So compared with the last one, right? So for the races or the demographic groups, for Asian usually is the lowest, 2.8%. But for the bachelor degrees and more, the unemployment rate is lower than the Asian. So what we can conclude from this table, if a person or group of people have a higher education level, then the participation rate for this group will be higher and the unemployment rate for this group will be lower. This shouldn't be surprised, right? Okay, and these two definitions are important definitions for unemployment. The first is the natural rate of unemployment, or the initial is NAIRU. The normal rate of unemployment around which unemployment rate fluctuates. The natural rate of unemployment is also the average number of different period result. So that's the normal rate of unemployment, which usually is the average value. The second definition is cyclical unemployment. It's the deviation of unemployment from its natural rate. So the natural rate is the natural rate of unemployment, and unemployment is the current unemployment rate or the real unemployment rate. The deviation or the difference between the real unemployment rate from the natural rate of unemployment, that's the cyclical unemployment. So let's see a picture here. That's the figure from the BLS or from the FRED. So we can see that the blue line is the real unemployment rate or the current unemployment rate. We can see the fluctuation is wild, right? It's move all the time. But for the natural rate of unemployment, again, that's kind of the average value. So there is not too much movement for the natural rate of unemployment. The change is really small and they usually change around 5%. This is 5%. And the natural rate of unemployment in United States between 1960 to 2021, just around 5%. That's just like the normal unemployment rate. And the difference here between the real or current unemployment rate, here, the blue line, between the natural rate, unemployment rate, which is the red line, the vertical difference is the cyclical unemployment rate. So we can see that usually during the recession, the shaded area during the recession, the unemployment rate will be higher than the natural rate of unemployment rate, which means the cyclical unemployment will be positive during the recession. But in booms, here, the unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate unemployment rate. So in booms, the cyclical unemployment rate will be negative in booms. So again, since the natural rate of unemployment rate is the average value, so if the current value of unemployment rate or the real unemployment rate is decreasing, then the natural rate of unemployment rate will also decrease. See here, it's decreasing, then the natural rate or the average value will decrease. When the real unemployment rate or current unemployment rate increase here, then you can see the natural rate of unemployment will also increase here. And that's during the pandemic, around or after 2020, we can see the unemployment rate is or was almost the highest during the last like 50 or 60 years, the highest level. So in each of the following, what happens to the unemployment rate? Remember, what's the unemployment rate? Unemployment rate should be the number of unemployment people divided by the labor force. That's the equation of times 100. The equation for this. So let's see the first one. Haley lost her job and begins looking for a new job. So what happens to the unemployment rate? And that's the unemployment rate gave an accurate impression of what's happening in the labor market. U rate increase or decrease? How to analyze that? Just analyze if the numerator, the number of unemployment go up, go down, or the labor force go up and go down. And you can get the result like if U rate go up or go down. So the result for the first one, the U rate should rise. How to do this kind of question? Again, you should consider what happened to the unemployment rate and what happened to the labor force, right? But my way is no matter what happens, what the sentence, what the question, usually I imagine that the initial unemployment rate just a half. That's my way. So if the initial unemployment rate is a half, which means there are only 2 people in the labor force. The one is employed and another is not employed. Another one is looking for the job at this moment. So for the first question A, Haley lost her job, which means at the beginning only 2 people and the 1 in the job, right? That's Haley. Haley was in employment before or was employed before. But at this moment, Haley is looking for the job. She is not employed anymore, which means after A, then what happens? The unemployed is decreased, right? Because before 2 people want to have a job and only 1 is already having the job, which is Haley. But at this moment, the employment decreased from 1 to 0. Because Haley was employed before, that was 1. But at this moment, she lost her job. So the numerator for unemployment should be 0. What happened to the denominator, to the labor force? Well, before, two people wanted work, right? And at this moment, although Haley lost her job, but she is still looking for the job. So the labor force doesn't change, right? So we can see before the unemployment rate was high, but at this moment was 0. So we can see the unemployment rate. Sorry, my bad. Unemployment rate should be here, right? Because, sorry, my bad. Before, two people in the job market and the one people already worked, which is Haley, and another people is looking for the job. So before, the unemployment rate, the number of unemployment was equal to 1. And then today, Haley lost her job, which means the number of unemployed people increased from 1 to 2, because Haley joined the group of people who is looking for the job. So the numerator should equals 2 here. So that's 1. All right. Sorry, my bad. Which means the unemployment rate will increase from 0.5 to 1. So that's the answer for the unemployment rate rises. So that's how I usually answer this kind of question. What changed to the U rate? And again, I usually imagine the initial number is a half. And according to the question, what happens to the number of unemployment people, and what happened to the labor force? So in this question, it's from 0.5 to 1, which is increase. And does the U rate give an accurate impression of what happening in the labor market? So the number of unemployed increases, labor force stayed the same because no one changed, right? A rising U rate gives the impression that the labor market is worsening, and it is. Because unemployment rate increase, which means that this market is worse than before. And what happens was the reality is Haley really lost her job. So that's the reality. That's really worse than before. So this explains the accurate result in the labor market. So that's how you should answer the question A. So how about for B? Again, just imagine the initial unemployment rate is a half, and for part B, what happened to the number of unemployment, and what happened to the labor force. The beginning unemployment rate was a half, right? And let's see what happened to the number of unemployment. Josiah, a steel worker who has been out of work since his mill closed, which means that's the initial situation, right? Before he was a worker, he had a job before, which means this one number of unemployment doesn't account him, right? So he had a job, but at this moment, he doesn't have the job, which means it also become discouraged and give up. Before, two people there. The one is looking for the job, and Josiah is the one who already had the job. And at this moment, Josiah doesn't have a job anymore, and he is giving up looking for the job, which means for the labor force, for the denominator, before two people, but at this moment only one, because Josiah is not looking for the job anymore. And in that case, since he is not looking for the job, so the number of unemployment is become to 0. So from 0.5 to 0, the result should be decreased. That's A. Okay, that's B. False. That's how you answer question B. the discouraged workers would like to work but having given up of looking for a job, classified as not in the labor force, should decrease both the denominator and the numerator. The U rate falls because no longer count as unemployed. That's how you need to answer part B. The falling U rate gives the impression that the labor market is improving, but it isn't. All right? Because the real situation is Josiah is giving up for looking for the job, which means the real market, the real job market is getting worse. But when we look at unemployment rate according to the data, the unemployment rate decrease, which means from the data, the job market is not that worse. So which means it's not as what the real market. That's part B. Try to read the C and we are going to do it together. And again, imagine that the initial number was a half. The one person is unemployment, that is looking for the job. And another is two people there. The one is looking for a job, another is already working. And such as crime, so earner in his family of 5 just lost his job, which means that this 80,000, before he had a job, right? So this one, the numerator, the number of unemployment shouldn't include him before. And at this moment, immediately he takes a part-time job, which means today, after C, he's still in the labor market. He's still worked, which means the number of unemployment doesn't change. And what about the labor force? Since he's still work, which means the labor force doesn't change either. So that's the original unemployment rate, that's the new unemployment rate. The number of unemployment doesn't change and the labor force doesn't change. So it should be equal to each other, so the result should be the same. U rate unchanged because a person is employed, whether they work full or part-time, the number of unemployment labor force stayed the same. But what happened to the real labor market? Because before he earned $80,000, but at this moment just have a part-time job, which means the situation for him is worse, or the situation in the job market is worse than before. But according to the unemployment rate, the data, it doesn't change. So the things are getting worse, but the U rate fails to show it. So that's question A, B, and C. Next one, measuring the unemployment rate. So as the question before, we calculate the different situations and the new unemployment rate. We can see that the unemployment rate is not a perfect indicator. And again, we have learned the CPI, the GDP. Both of those two are not perfect indicators, but we still need to use these three, right? Because they are still very useful. Although they are not perfect indicators, and why? Because it includes some discouraged workers. It may do not distinguish between the full-time job, part-time worker, or the people working part-time job because full-time job not available, or some people misreport their work status. Because of these three reasons, the unemployment rate may be not a perfect indicator, but it's still really useful. It could be a barometer of labor market and the economy. How long are unemployed without work? Well, you need to understand these two situations. The first sentence is, most spells of unemployment are short. Typically, 1/3 of the unemployed have been unemployed under 5 weeks. 2/3 have been unemployed under 15 weeks, but most of them are shorter. Only 21% have been unemployed over 6 months. So here we can see that only smaller amount of unemployment people are longer than 6 months. But most of them, or 80% of them, under 14 weeks, which means under 3 months, right? So most people, most spells of unemployment are short. Most observed unemployment is long-term. The small group of long-term unemployed persons has fairly little turnover, so it accounts for most of unemployment observed over time. So it seems like these two sentences are kind of opposite, right? So I'm going to give you an example to explain this clearly, I hope so. So imagine I'm the person who do the collecting data to count the unemployment. I'm the person to do that job. And I'm going to collect the data every week. So every week, in 1 year, there are 55 weeks together, right? The whole years. So every week, I'm going to count how many people do not have a job. Such as the first week, I found that 4 people do not have a job. So person 1, person 2, 3, 4. 4 people together do not have a job in week 1. In week 2, I still find like 4 people do not have work, but they are person 1, person 2, person 3. Again, the same 3 people as the week 1, but the last person is person 5. It's different from the last week because person 4 found a job between week 1 and week 2. That's what I have in week 2. And how about in week 3? When I count how many people do not have a job in week 3, I still find 4 people here. And again, 1, 2, 3. These 3 people still do not find a job. And for person 5, find a new job in week 2, but a new person lost his or her job in week 3. And the same up until week 55. In week 55, I still find like 4 people do not have a job. 1, 2, 3, and 58 maybe. Because for the last person, usually they can find a job really or in the short time. So which means the first sentence, right? Remember, most people can find a job in a short run, which means these group people from person 4 to person 58. Like 55 of them could find a job really fast in a short run. But these 3 people, I can find these 3 people every week from week 1 to week 55. So which means for these 3 people, they cannot find a job in the long run. The whole year, they cannot find a job. So if you understand this example, let's go back to our slide. So most observed unemployment is long run, which this most observed is that 3 people I observed. Person 1, person 2, and person 3. I can see them all the time, every week, from week 1 to week 55. I can see them all the time, so they are the most observed unemployment. So they are the long term. But for most people, from person 4 to person 58, there are most people because 55 out of 58, the total population I could see during my work are 58 people, but 55 of them can find a job within 1 week. So which means most the spells of unemployment are short. but most observed unemployment is long term. All right, so you should remember my example and remember these two sentences. How to understand these two sentences? Use my example. Again, these two terms are also very important terms in this chapter for unemployment rate. Why are always some people unemployed? So two terms. First is the frictional unemployment rate. That occurs when workers spend time searching for the job that best suit their skills and tastes. So in this frictional unemployment, usually it's the short term for most workers. Again, back to the last slide, remember most people could find a job in a short run. So in this one, for the frictional unemployment, that's the short run, because most people can find a job really fast. But for the structural unemployment, it occurs when the number of jobs available in some labor market is insufficient to provide a job for everyone who wants one. And usually this is the longer run, longer term. So how do you distinguish these two terms? You can think what caused the unemployment rate. If the situation, if the reason is only happened in the short run, short term, then that's the fractional unemployment. If the reason, if the situation will cause the unemployment in the long run, that situation will last in the long run, then that will cause the structural unemployment rate. All right? How to distinguish these two terms? Remember the short term and the longer term. Temporary unemployment rate is the frictional unemployment, and the permanent unemployment rate is the structural unemployment rate. And usually for the long term, if the unemployment rate increase, usually the natural rate of unemployment will increase. And even though the economy is doing well, usually you will always see some unemployment. Like the natural rate of unemployment rate in the United States, around 5%. No matter the economy is good or bad, some unemployment just there. Next part, job search. The process by which workers find appropriate jobs given their tastes and skills, that's easy. Some frictional unemployment is inevitable, just like I said. No matter the economy is in booms or in recessions, usually that happens. And for frictional unemployment, that's the short run, remember? So that's the sectoral shifts, change in the compositions of demand among industries or regions. Changing patterns of international trade that could cause the frictional unemployment change. And also because of the economy is always changing. So how to understand the sectoral shifts? Change in the economy in some industry will cause some higher unemployment rate and some area with lower employment rate. Why? Let's see an example. Imagine there is two industries. One is oil producing firms, and the other is car producing firms or areas. For oil producing in the United States, we can imagine it's Texas. TAS. And for car producing, you can imagine it's Michigan. So two areas with two different industries. What happens if the oil price of oil go up? What will happen? If the price will go up, which means for oil producing industry, the revenue will go up, right? Then the production P will go up in this industry or in this region, and then production go up, which means U rate will decrease. But if the price of oil go up, what happens to the car producing industry? Because the price of input is higher, then lots of people do not want to drive cars, so they maybe take more public transportation or whatever. Then the consumers are going to need fewer cars than before. Then for the car industry, the production will decrease. This is the production, all right? Production. For the P here, that's the production. If the production of a car industry decrease, then the yield rate will increase. That's what happens when the oil price increase. And what happens if the oil price decrease? If the oil price decrease, that's the opposite, right? So for the oil producing industry or area, the production, P, production, will decrease because the revenue decrease. The unemployment rate will increase. And the opposite for the car producing industry, the production will increase and the yield rate will decrease. So according to this example, we can understand that some market change or the economy in some area, in some country change, then the unemployment rate will change. The production will change and the unemployment rate will change as well. And that's explain the sectorial shifts, change in the composition of demand among industries or regions. Okay, then because unemployment rate is a bad thing, we do not want that. What can government do to reduce the unemployment rate? And again, the government can reduce, not eliminate, remember? Because the natural rate of unemployment rate will always be positive, and usually around 5%. So we can reduce that, we can try to reduce it, but not eliminate. The best way to reduce it, what government can do, just in the short run, because some policies happen, the short run situation will change, and that will affect the frictional unemployment rate. So what the government usually do, the government run employment agencies, provide information about job vacancies, public training programs, equip displaced workers with skills needed in growing industries. Advocate, some people supported this for the government's role, like keeps the labor force more fully employed, like good training and some information, that's good, and reduce the inequities inherent in a constantly changing market economy. When the market economy change, like the oil price go up or go down, the different areas economy will change. So government will try to decrease that influence. That's the people who support the government's influence, but some other group of people do not like that. The critics' reason should be like, should the government involve with the process of job search? Because in the economy market, it should all decisions should be decided by the demand and supply, right? The household and firms and whatever, just two parts. Government should not step in too much, or no government's role. The market will decide everything, and that would be the perfect allocation. So in this case, some people think the government should not involve, because the market will tell them what they need to do. And usually the market or the private market could match workers and jobs. The government is most likely worse because the government usually disseminating the right information to the right workers, or deciding what kind of workers training would be most valuable. And in the reality, usually the market or the job market just decided by the private market or private part, such as newspapers, ads, online job sites, college career offices or headhunters, right? Usually just people looking for a job or looking for this kind of information privately or in the private market. That's what we usually do. And also, much workers' education is done also privately through either the schools or the on-the-job training. And usually governments do not do too much in this part. So that's the debate, if government should do something here. The next part is the unemployment insurance. The initial is UI. It's the governmental program that partially protects the workers' incomes when they become unemployed, reduces the hardship of unemployment, increases unemployment. So usually what we imagine that unemployment insurance is a good thing, right? We love it. On the other hand, it will also increase the unemployment rate. Why? Because that benefit ends when a worker takes a job. So workers have less incentive to search or take jobs while eligible to receive benefits. What kind of benefits of UI? It will reduce the income uncertainty because even though I'm not in the job market, I still have some income to survive. But the other benefit is the unemployed have more time to search a job, so I do not have too much pressure. I can find a better job, right? Can look for jobs that better suit their taste and skills. So that will influence the frictional unemployment rate. It also improves the ability of economy to match each workers with most appropriate job. So why it's the frictional, not the structural? Remember, because the difference between these two terms, for frictional, that's the short term. For the structural, that's the longer term. So how about the benefit of unemployment rate insurance? That will not happen forever. I cannot get that type of insurance forever, just a little period of time. And typically in the United States, the UI is 50% of the former wages and for 26 weeks. So 26 weeks is just a small or short run, it's not forever. So in this case, the benefit of UI will only influence the frictional unemployment. So structural unemployment. The difference again between the structural and the frictional is the short term and the long term, right? For the UI is the short term. And in this part, we are going to talk about the long term. Explain the structural unemployment rate, and usually that will occur when the wage is kept above the equilibrium. And there are three reasons for this. The first is minimum wage law. The second is unions and collective bargaining power or bargaining. And the third one is the efficiency wage. Up until now, we have learned the three markets. So this one is the newest one, is the labor market. You can see for the labor market, the horizontal line is the labor force, and the vertical line is the wage. So three markets we have learned so far. First is the product market. The second is the loanable funds. Funds market, and the last one, what we learned today, is the labor market. You have supply and demand curve for all of them. Supply, demand, supply, demand, supply, demand. And the supply will always be the upward, and the demand will always be the downward. But difference is the unit for different axes. For the product market, the vertical should be the price and quantity, right? The supply is the sellers here, or the firms. The demand is the consumers or buyers. That's the product market, and that's the equilibrium point. We can, if there is no government, let the market to decide everything. We can find the perfect price and the perfect quantity here. That's the product market. And the second one, which we learned in this chapter, is the loanable funds. The vertical axis is the interest rate is R, and the horizontal axis is the loanable funds. The supply should be the saving. This is the national saving, all right, X. It should be the elements of private saving plus the public saving. And demand here is the investment. That's the demand in the loanable funds market. And the equilibrium point, we can see the perfect interest rate and how much money in this market, loanable funds market, how much money the investors are going to need and how much money the savers are going to save in this market. And the newest one is the labor market, which we learned today. So the vertical line is the wage, the horizontal line is the labor force. So the three pairs are different. So please distinguish these three pictures. And in the labor market, the supply curve is the laborers. And demand curve is the firm or employers. That's the demand. If there is no other part just decided by the market, we again could find an equilibrium point. The horizontal is the wage, the equilibrium wage, like the horizontal decided by the perfect quantity of labor. How many laborers can find a job? The amount of laborers could match with the number of firms who open the positions or whatever. So that's the equilibrium wage, and that's usually the wage should happen in the labor market. And that's also usually the average wage in the countries, societies, or whatever. So please distinguish these these three markets. They are different, so do not get confused. Like here, the supply curve is the laborers, but here, the demand curve is, you can say it's laborers, buyers, consumers. And in the labor market, the demand curve is firms. But in the product market, the supply curve, usually the firms. So these two markets are totally different. Some students get confused before. So structural unemployment occurs when there are not enough jobs to go around. It occurs when the wage is kept above equilibrium. All right. So in this picture, we will know that if there is a demand curve and supply curve, the intersection would be the equilibrium point. So the equilibrium here, that's the equilibrium labor force in this market. And that's the equilibrium wage. That's the best wage in this market. But something will happen which will keep the wage above the equilibrium, like here, W1. Something happened, moved W star from the equilibrium wage to W1 here. So in this case, supply is bigger than the demand, right? So that's the surplus. And I think that's it. It's bigger. Okay, yeah, that's the graph on the blackboard. So what will cause this happening for W1 or the wage is higher than the equilibrium wage. So usually there are three reasons for this. Minimum wage laws, unions, and collective bargaining, efficiency wages. So let's see them one by one. The first one is the minimum wage may exceed the equilibrium wage for the least skilled and least experienced workers, causing structural employment. Quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity labor demand, right? Like this one. That's the quantity supplied for the labor. And that's why it's exceed the quantity demanded or the labor demanded by the firm. So there will be a surplus over here. Workers are unemployed because they are waiting for the job opening. Since there are more supply and fewer demanded, so lots of workers are going to wait in the market for more firms open their positions. That's the minimum wage. And by the way, I want to add one thing. For the minimum wage law, usually the minimum wage should be higher than the equilibrium. If the government have a law set the minimum wage which is smaller, W2 which is smaller than equilibrium wage, which means that this W2 will not work. Because that's the minimum wage, but the firms could set their wage higher than that, right? If the government set a wage which is smaller than the equilibrium wage, which means small supply and bigger demand, large demand, and the firms are going to increase their wage to attract more laborers for them, which means that will increase the wage back to the equilibrium. Only when the laws set a minimum wage which is bigger than the equilibrium wage, and that law will work. And which means for the minimum wage, usually it has to be bigger than the equilibrium wage. So the minimum wage usually good for the young people or for the people who has less educated, or some people have a part-time job. But usually the minimum wage will cause the structural unemployment because fewer demand from the firm and the more supply from the laborers. Next reason is the union, worker association that bargains with employers over wages, benefits, and working conditions. That's common here. And sorry, I shouldn't say that. You know the union, right? But it's not common right now. So the union exert their market power to negotiate higher wages for workers because unions are association of a huge amount of people. When these people get together, they have a huge power to bargaining with the firm. So of course they want a higher wage. They have some kind of market power here. The typical union workers earn 10 to 20% higher wages and get more benefits than union workers for the same type of work. So again, since people in the union, they have market power, so they are going to negotiate with the firms, which will cause the wage go up, right? So which is above the equilibrium wage. And when the wage is above the equilibrium, which means supply is going to be bigger than the demand, surplus happens, and some people are going to lose their job because some laborers, some supply cannot find a job. Unions raise the wage above equilibrium. Unions use collective bargaining and strikes to achieve higher wages for their members, and that's the definition for collective bargaining and the strike. So quantity of labor demanded fall and unemployment result. Again, when the wage is higher than the equilibrium wage and the unemployment happened. And still, as this one, the union is not a short run, right? the union is like it will last forever. That's a long run policy or something. So the wage will always, all the time, higher than the equilibrium. If union is there, then the wage will always higher than the equilibrium, which means the unemployment will always happen. When the unemployment is the long term, which means that unemployment belongs to structural unemployment. Insiders, workers who remain employed are better off, and outsiders, workers who lost their jobs are worse off. I'm going to draw a smaller line. These two charts are the labor market, all right? That's the wage, that's the labor force, supply, demand. On the left figure, that's the insider. And this part is the outsider. At the beginning, if there is no union, then the supply and demand should equal to each other, no matter inside of the union or outside. So in this market, the equilibrium wage should be the same. There is no difference. People can move around to different firms. But such as this part, some unionized in this part, that's the insider, right? And the result of the union, which will move the wage up from the equilibrium to a higher wage here, W prime, which will cause a surplus, which means that some laborers are going to lose their job in this market. What will happen to this group of laborers after they lost their job? They are going to move to the outsiders, right? So this amount of laborers are going to move to the outsider, so which means will cause the supply curve. Remember, the supply curve is the laborers, which means supply curve are going to shift to the right hand side. More laborers in the outsider market, which will cause the wage decrease and more labor force here. Higher wage, lower wage. This is not too lower. That's a big amount of labor force in the outsiders. Some outsiders go to non-unionized labor markets, which increase the labor supply and reduce the wage in those markets. That's what I draw on the blackboard. So some debates about the unions. So critics, the unions are cartels. They raise wages above equilibrium, which causes unemployment, that's true. And also that unemployment is structural unemployment. And deprices wages in non-union labor market. For the outsiders, the wage decreased. And that's inefficient and inequitable. According to the market economy, so everything should be decided by the market. If we have a supply curve and demand curve, then equilibrium will slide, and the wage and the labor force will be the perfect one. But if something happens and change the equilibrium point, which means inefficient, right? According to the market economy. But there are also some advocates. Unions counter the market power of large firms. To make firms more responsive to workers' concerns, keep a happy and productive workforce. So in the United States, before there were huge amounts of people who want to unionize unions, like in the 1940s and the 1950s. Around 33% of the United labor force was unionized at that moment. But today, less than 11% US workers belong to the unions. So today, only around 10% people are in the unions. Okay, the third reason is the efficiency wages. According to the first two, no matter it's because of the minimum wage laws or the unions, that in that two ways, firms involuntarily pay workers a higher wage, right? But in this theory, in the third theory, efficiency wages, which means firms voluntarily pay above equilibrium wages to boost the worker productivity and increase the firm productivity. There are different types of efficiency wage theories. What are they? The first one is the worker health. In less developed countries, poor nutrition is a common problem. Paying higher wages allows workers to eat better and make them healthier, more productive. This is related to the human capital, right? That's about nutrition and healthcare. If people are healthier, of course they are more productive. But usually this only happened in the developing countries or in poor countries, such as in the United States. This one doesn't work. All right. So usually in less developed countries, poor nutrition is a common problem. So that's the first reason. The second reason is the worker turnover. Hiring, training new workers is costly, right? Because employers should place in ads and interview candidates, training new employees, and also usually the new workers are low productive, right? So which means if workers turn over a lot frequently, move around, and then hiring and training new workers is costly. Paying higher wage gives workers more incentive to stay and reduces turnover. This is the second reason. Third one, worker quality. Offering higher wages attracts better job applicants, increase the quantity of the firm's workforce. Again, higher wage will attract higher productivity workers. So higher productivity, of course, that's good to the firms, and that's the reason why firms want to voluntarily increase their wage. The last reason is the worker effort. Workers can work hard or shirk. Shirkers are fired if it counts. So if the wage is higher, then the opportunity cost for workers to shirk is really high. So for regional workers, if the wage is high enough, they are going to work really hard. And also in that way, the productivity for that worker from that worker will really high. For the firm, of course, more revenues. Is being fired a good deterrent? So it depends on how hard it is to find another job, right? And if the market wage is above equilibrium wage, there aren't enough jobs to go around, so workers have more incentive to work instead of shirking. Let's do one example question here. Which of the following would be most likely to reduce the frictional unemployment? And remember, for frictional unemployment, that's the short run. So how to distinguish frictional and structural? You should decide what reasons cause the unemployment. If the reason is short term, which means that unemployment will be the frictional. If the reason is it will last forever, it's the long run, then that should belong to the structural unemployment. The government eliminates the minimum wage. So will that influence the market, the labor market, only in the short run or in the long run? Remember, for the minimum wage law, that should be forever, right? If law is there, which means the wage will always higher than the equilibrium wage. So that's the structural unemployment. That's the reason cause the structural unemployment. And what if the government eliminates the minimum wage, which means that this will disappear forever. And the unemployment rate or labors caused by the minimum wage will disappear forever. So that should be likely to reduce the structural unemployment. Just again, think about the reason. Since the minimum wage is the long run, so it's likely to reduce structural unemployment, not the friction. The government increases unemployment insurance benefit, likely to increase frictional unemployment, not to reduce it. Again, think about the reason, right? The insurance benefit is the short run. Remember, the frictional, for the government's policy, I think only one reason to cause the frictional unemployment, and that's the unemployment insurance, which is this one. So this one will cause the frictional unemployment. That's the short run influence, because it will only last 26 weeks. Even though it's increased the benefit, but still it will not last forever. So which means this policy is still short run. So that's the frictional unemployment. Because of short run, that belongs to the frictional unemployment. But this is correct. That should increase the frictional unemployment, not reduce it. So B is no. And also for the structural unemployment, what usually will cause that? The minimum wage, the union, and the efficiency wages. 3 reasons. So how about C? A new law by labor unions is likely to reduce the structural unemployment. And again, remember, the union belongs to the structural unemployment. If the government bans that unions, which means it will reduce the structural unemployment, but not frictional. Yeah, that's correct. Not reduce frictional unemployment. So C is no as well. How about D? Likely to speed up the process of matching jobs, workers, and which would reduce the frictional unemployment. How about E? E, likely to increase the frictional unemployment, not to reduce it. If this happens frequently, which means the economy will change so fast, some people will lose their job frequently. In that way, frequently means the short run, so increase the frictional unemployment, not to reduce it.